Glad you're here. I have something I want to start off with today because I do not turn down a dare, ever. This has nothing to do with the message, but if we are friends on Facebook, you saw me wearing a certain New Year's hat that my children and I crafted together on New Year's Eve, and I was dared to wear it this morning. So give me 1 second. So unfortunately, I have to preach in this while the television company is here. I'm kidding. I'm not going to wear it. Dare accepted. Done. I win. Let's pray and we'll all go home. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. Last Sunday, we started a study together where we are walking line by line through that prayer that we just prayed here, that we pray every week at CIB, commonly known as the Lord's Prayer. We find it in both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but in both, Jesus is responding to his followers when they are asking him to teach them how to pray. In week 1, we looked at the opening line of the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. We looked at what Jesus was trying to communicate to his followers in this opening line. And what we discovered is that Jesus was asking his followers to think of and pray to and believe in something less like a God and more like a father figure who sees all things from a heavenly or elevated perspective. If you were unable to be with us and you want to hear that talk, you can listen to it on our website. Now, today in week 2, we're looking at the second line in the prayer, Hallowed or hallowed be thy name. What does that mean? Do we really know what that means? Of course it sounds important because anything that's said in Elizabethan English sounds important, right? But what does it mean for something to be hallowed? And also, wait, you're telling me that God has a name? I thought that God's name was God. Isn't that why we call God God? These are the two things that Jesus is trying to teach his followers in this second line of this prayer that he's modeling for them. So, hallowed or hallowed, what does that mean for something to be hallowed? You may have heard the phrase before, hallowed ground. We often use that phrase when we're talking about a cemetery or a churchyard or a memorial of some kind. I'm often reminded of that phrase multiple times throughout the year as I have to visit such places in my line of work. My grandfather, who I loved, who was very dear to me, is buried in a field on the outskirts of a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere called Herman, Pennsylvania. And whenever I have the chance to, I go out there and I spend a few moments standing at his grave and I remember him. It always takes me a few minutes to find this grave. There are no markers for it. His gravestone doesn't sit above ground. My grandfather could squeeze a nickel out of a penny. He wasn't going to spend money on a gravestone. But because it matters to me, I search through the grass and I finally find it each time. My grandfather was and still is one of my role models. He was a World War II veteran, and he found God on the island of Guam. He was out in the woods during the war, and he had just received word from his commander that the war had ended. And the problem was that the Japanese communications on the island of Guam were down. And the Japanese didn't know that they were supposed to stop fighting. So the Japanese soldiers were still firing on the Americans, but the Americans were instructed to just hide and not return fire on the Japanese army. And my grandfather told me that it was in this experience where he met God. It was getting dark and he had been laying in the brush for hours, and he was laying on the ground looking up through the tops of the trees, and he could see the sky peeking through. And in that moment, he told God that if God would allow him to make it home safely, that he would live his life differently than he did before the war. And I think about that story and the many other stories that he told every time I'm standing there looking at his grave. The place, the graveyard, is hallowed, sure, but I also cherish it because of who is laid to rest there. My grandfather's life and my memories of him are sacred things, hallowed things, and meaningful things to me. What is hallowed to you in your life today? What's sacred to you? What are the things that you deeply cherish? We ascribe meaning and hallowedness to something or someone based on our past experiences with it or them. And Jesus is saying that our walk with God is to be one of those things too. Something that makes us stop and think. Something that is worth looking for, even though it might be hard to find. Something that, when we remember it, draws us into deeper places in the often shallow frenzy of our lives. Hallowed, to esteem, to cherish, to think of as sacred or holy. That's the first thing we see Jesus telling us in the second line of this prayer. Now next, Jesus also says that God has a name. Did you know that? His name is Fred. I'm kidding. It's not. But think about that for a second. The word God is not a name. It's a label. It's a category of being, right? The word Father that Jesus uses in the first line of the prayer that we looked at last week is not a name either. It's a title for someone who has children. My dad's name is not Dad. It's on his driver's license, his name. His social security card, his business cards, etc. I call him Dad because that's the role he occupies in my life. But that's not his name. And it's the same with God. God also has a name, and it's important that we know what it is because it means something important. What is it? What would it have been to Jesus at the time and in the culture in which he lived? If we go back to the 3rd chapter of Exodus in the Old Testament, we find Moses, the great lawgiver, asking God what God's name is, and this is what the dialogue says. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.'" That's a label, right? It's a category of being. And then they ask me, "What is his name? What shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am that I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." Now those words in English, I am that I am, or I am, there's a word there that's used in Hebrew that scholars don't quite fully understand because it's just a mishmash of 4 Hebrew letters, the letters Yod, He, Vav, and He. And what's more is that this name for God is used 5,410 times in the Bible. So even just by repetition, it's something we ought to know the meaning of. It's something that just by repetition is important. And the closest scholars are able to get to translating this into English is, I am here, I exist, or I am that which is ever present. So in English, we add some vowels in there in between the consonants so that we can say it out loud. And this is where we get the names Yahweh, or Yehovah, or Jehovah. And God says to Moses, "This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So if we move forward in the generations from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus, we see the religion of Jesus, ancient Judaism, this faith context in which he's living and doing his work during his lifetime, would have supported this. Jesus would have been taught from a very young age that the name of God is Yahweh, or Yehovah, or Jehovah. So when Jesus says the words, hallowed or hallowed be thy name, he's admonishing his followers to think of the sacred and holy God as I am, I exist, or I am that which is ever present. Hallowed be thy name, the sacred, holy God that is ever present, the God who is right here, right now. I don't know about you, but I often think of God in terms of the future, what's ahead of me down the road, rather than I do the God in the now. And I suppose that's what it is to be human, especially here in the West where we love to chase things. We think of our lives in chronos time or in chronological order, meaning that we think of our life as a timeline that moves forward from beginning to end with these goals and these wants and these milestones along the way. And if we really think about it, and we take an inventory of what our days are comprised of, our appointments, our efforts, our thoughts, and yes, even our prayers, we are often all too consumed with everything but the now. We're always racing, we're always chasing, we're always looking forward, but rarely ever are we just focusing on where we are in the moment. And Jesus, here in this second line of the prayer, is wanting us to cherish and esteem and to think of the now as a sacred and hallowed thing. God is not just back there, God is not just up there. God is right here, right now. My dad used to tell me a story about being present. When I was a kid, I was just all over the place, couldn't sit still, was always trying to go on to the next thing. And my dad used to tell me this story about how to live in the moment. It's a story about these two surgeons, and the story goes that a young surgeon had just started his residency at a prestigious teaching hospital. And he was paired with this older surgeon who had been there for a very long time, who would, in the coming months, train the younger surgeon in the perfecting of his craft. And so, on this new surgeon's very first day, a patient arrived at the ER, and she was bleeding profusely out of this deep laceration in her neck. And they immediately wheeled her into the operating room. And the younger surgeon and the older surgeon scrubbed up, and they hurried in to operate on her. And the older surgeon turned to the younger surgeon and said, "She's lacerated a major artery. You need to remove the damaged portion, suture it back up, and close the wound." And the young surgeon nervously asked, with beads of sweat running down his face, white as a ghost, he said, "Well, how much time do I have to do that?" And the older surgeon responded, "She only has about 40 seconds to live. So slow down, take your time, and do the job right. She'll die if you hurry." For me, I find that one of the most difficult things about being human is being able to separate what is primary from what is secondary or even tertiary. Life, it seems, has a way of slicing up our attention into tiny pieces, and the pieces are so small that they often become indistinguishable from one another. It can be so difficult in life to take time to pause and just breathe and be present in the moment. And in this phrase, hallowed be thy name, four simple but profound words, Jesus is trying to teach us to set apart and to focus on the ever-present God, if even for a moment. God is with us in every moment, always. You know that God is not closer to you because you're in a church right now than he is when you leave this place? You know that God is not closer to you when you're praying than he is when you're working? Did you know that God is not closer to you when you're in a moment of meditation? God is close to you, and he's always close all the time. God's distance from you is never different depending on what you're doing. God is here always in every moment, just a thought away. Will we hallow that? Will we esteem that? Will we treat that as attention worthy? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Our Father of all, who sees all things from a heavenly perspective, you are sacred and holy and now. How might living with that idea of God and carrying that idea of God around in our minds during the day with us, how might that change the ways that we live in the world? How might that make us into beings that are less responsive, less thoughtlessly responsive to stimuli in our lives? If we just put some space between the stimulus and the response and recognize that God is with us. Would it cause us to treat our enemies differently? Would it cause us to respond to anger and hurt in the world differently? If we just stopped and weren't worried about the next thing for a minute and just focused on the now. That's what Jesus is trying to teach us here. And I would challenge you this week to do that. To think of your life not as stimulus and response, but as stimulus, contemplation, response. And see what it does to your week, to your relationships, to some of the things you're facing. I think you might be surprised how it changes.